Ananish, you're with us. Ananish is a professor of experimental economics at Auckland University. He's been posting various pieces in the main newspapers about the effect economically as well on of COVID and lockdown. He's joining us to take another look at, I guess, summarize a lot of that and why we can't just trust the science, which is what we've been asked to do blindly for the past year. Over to you, Ananish. I think. Can we hear you?
Yes. Can you hear me, Mark?
We can. Yes, we
okay.
can.
All right. Let me start my slideshow. And okay, can you see my slides?
Okay, you're away.
Okay. All right. Thank you. No mai haramai, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you everyone for being here. Thank you, Mark, for organizing this and for giving me a chance to speak. So I'm going to try and touch upon 4 key points. Depends a little bit on how much time I have and how much time this takes. So let me get right into it. And I'm not going to repeat anything I said from back in the August symposium. Those who may be interested in some of the more behavioral science aspects of this would be well advised to look at some of the presentations there. So I'm going to talk about some new things. So as Mark just pointed out, I'm going to talk about why we cannot just trust the science. I'm going to talk a little bit about something called the conjunction fallacy and how we overweight very small probabilities, which are the direct bearing on lockdowns and the search for a vaccine. It might be a little technical, but hopefully I'll take you through that. Then I will talk about something that needs to be confronted, and that's the racial divide in COVID-19 policymaking. When I talk about racial divide, I'm talking about cross-country differences. And the fact that the COVID-19 policy has been designed to benefit the white, rich nations of the world at the expense of poor Black nations. And finally, if I have time, I will talk briefly about this new narrative that we have listened to recently, that this 4.9% unemployment rate, how great it is, and how it shows that the best health response was the best economic response. And I will try and convince you that that's just complete nonsense. And it's a bit of a shame that journalists have gotten into this rah-rah pro-government cheerleading mode, because these are questions that they could have asked. And I'll show you some data that I have collected by talking to Stats New Zealand. Okay, so let's get started. Why can't we just start the science? Because the science here, essentially, when people say trust the science, they were basically saying that trust the epidemiologists about the disease. But what the epidemiologists or even the regular public didn't understand is the limits to their expertise. Because most of the questions that we are being faced with in this pandemic were not epidemiological questions, or they went far beyond epidemiological questions. For instance, an epidemiologist can certainly tell me what the CFR or the IFR is and the disease vector and things like that, T cells, antibodies, PCR, RTs, and things like that. But beyond the point, it's a job for elected leaders to figure out what to do with that number or that information. For instance, how does that compare to other risks that we face in our day-to-day lives? How much are we willing to sacrifice to reduce this risk, knowing fully well that it's impossible to get this risk down to zero? So let me talk a little bit about this so-called SIR model that everybody talks about. The SIR model really stands for, and I'm assuming most people know this by now, it really stands for susceptible, infected, and recovered. Now, in the earliest version, recovered could mean recovered live or recovered dead. So essentially what this means is that at any period today or a time period t, everyone is susceptible. In time period t plus 1, some people get infected, others don't. And then at time period t plus 2, some of the infected ones recover or they die, and the infection spreads to the population, depending on what you assume about the rate of infection, how quickly it spreads. So this so-called thing called R0, right? So what's the problem with this? So this is what all these people, all the people around the world, whether it's Neil Ferguson or Sean Handy or Michael Baker, this is the model they're working off. Now, in this model, really, what happens is you start with some starting values and you set these things up. So you think of these as computer simulations or agent-based modeling, where you basically start with some starting values and that kind of spreads through the population. And in doing this, what they're assuming is there are two options: either locking down, so completely stopping any potential spread of infection, or letting it rip. So let the infection spread through the population. Which is why when we learned that the infection fatality ratio was actually 0.65%, the scientists still went ahead and said, well, 0.65% means that if you just multiply that by 330 million people in the United States, this would be more than 2 million deaths. It'll be more than 60,000 deaths in Sweden, et cetera, et cetera. And as we all know, none of that came to pass. So the reason why none of that came to pass is because these models don't incorporate any assumptions about human behavior, because humans are not really automatons, right? So faced with a deadly pandemic, they respond in many different ways by trying to reduce the risk. So very briefly, think about this in the following way, right? So COVID-19 presents us with what may be thought of as a social dilemma. What is the dilemma? The dilemma is that collectively, we are all better off if we stay indoors and don't spread the disease. So we behave as if we all have COVID-19. So we isolate ourselves and don't engage in any community spread. But the problem, of course, is that this is not quite individually rational. Individually, each of us think, well, if everybody else stays home and I go about my business, I go and visit people or go out to restaurants and things, how much does it increase the risk in aggregate? That's a minuscule, infinitesimal amount. So I go about my business. So individually, it's not rational to self-isolate. But the problem, of course, is if it is not individually rational for me to self-isolate, then the same is true for everyone else, because everyone else is rational as well. So we go around and we kind of, spread the disease. So the governments responded to this negative externality by insisting that lockdowns were the only way to deal with this. Now, this flies in the face of enormous amount of research about human behavior. So now the papers are now coming out. Some of these are technical, some of them read the data, but there were multiple intermediate strategies that were available to avoid or minimize total harm, right? So think about this way. So let's say that there's some kind of function where this is, let's say we are thinking about aggregate benefit, and this aggregate benefit function reaches a peak at this point. So collectively, we all want to be at the point O. And let's say, to take a common popular perception, these are all right-leaning people and these are all left-leaning people. Let's call them Republicans and Democrats. So the problem really is that the right-leaning people may not have been doing enough. But what the left-leaning people don't seem to understand is that they are doing too much. So collectively, we want to be at the point O. The right wing might be stopping short of it, but the left wing, in some senses, and I'm using these words very broadly, are going too far in terms of social distancing. Okay. Now, this is a big quote, so I'm going to go ahead and read this out. This is from Ross Douthat's column in New York Times. And what he says, you don't have to read it, I'll read it out for you. He says, for many crucial decisions, he says that what we had was an abdication by the elected officials of responsibility for decisions that are fundamentally political in nature. When we look back over the pandemic era, one of the signal failures will be the inability to acknowledge that many decisions, from our vaccine policy to our lockdown strategy to our approach to businesses and schools, are fundamentally questions of statesmanship, involving not just the right principles or the right technical understanding of the problem, but the prudential balancing of many competing goods. So in order to get the science right, we needed to understand not only the epidemiological science, but the science behind human behavior. Okay. So that's why I don't think this mantra of trusting the science makes any sense. All right. Let me move on to my next topic. So we all understood this, that, well, we needed to lock down to flatten the curve. All of you know this. You've seen versions of this all over the place. But flatten the curve till what point? Well, an obvious implication was that we are spending billions of dollars, so we will most likely flatten the curve till a vaccine arrives. Of course, that's not the entire answer, but that certainly was one thinking that, well, let's keep going till we can find a vaccine. What's the problem with that? The problem with that, and I'm sure Byram has talked about this, and Gerhard talked about this, is that vaccines take a long time. And Simon touched upon this. So here's what happened in the world. So on March 11th, the WHO declared COVID to be a pandemic. And look at, these are just the OECD countries. And this would be true of other countries as well, is that look at the degree of what might be called mimicry or imitation. Pretty much every country, very rapidly within the next 2 weeks, this is regardless of their age profile, regardless of their health systems, regardless of the infection rate in the country, regardless of the fact whether there were islands in the middle of the Pacific or not, every country moved to implement the same exact proposals and the policies: school closures, cancellation of public events, closing down airports, closing down borders. So you can see how every single country essentially did the same thing because it was politically too risky not to do this. And of course, we don't want to be an outlier. And look at what happened to Sweden that dared to be an outlier. Okay. Now, Gerhard just pointed this out. It takes a long time to develop vaccines. So I'm going to skip some of this. So in the case of COVID-19, our aim was to find a vaccine within 18 months. Let me skip this next slide because I'm going to run out of time. But what's the problem with this? The problem is that, first of all, you needed a vaccine that was effective. It wasn't clear, or it's not clear how effective these vaccines are going to be given the rush. But then you also had to have enough production. You also had to keep them frozen. You had to distribute them around the world, and so on and so forth, because you cannot be free of COVID-19 till the rest of the world is free of COVID-19, which means you really have to get this out to 7 billion people in the planet in short order. Is that likely? Yes. What's going to happen soon? No. But why did people do this? Because we don't perceive probabilities properly. So this is a little bit technical. Stay with me. Hopefully it'll make sense and I should get the main point across. So let's say these are the probabilities: 20%, 40%, 60%, 80%, and 100%. What happens is that the human brain is so developed that we routinely overweight small probabilities. So the perceived probabilities look like this kind of sideways tilted S-curve. What that means really is that when we have a probability of 20%, our brain essentially perceives this as a 40% probability. This is why, in some sense, people buy lottery tickets. If you think about it rationally, your chances of winning the lottery are minuscule. But we overweight that very small probability. We think the chances are higher than it really is, which is why all around the world, everybody believed that because we were spending billions of dollars, somehow or the other, we can beat the laws of nature and get a vaccine in short order. If there are questions, I'll happy to answer it, but I'm going to move on simply by saying that the quest for a vaccine was predicated on this idea of overweighting a very small probability event. And the rush to get this vaccine also means that it's not very effective. And I skipped over parts of that. Okay. So a lot of this is overweighting of small probabilities, and there's a corresponding underweighting of large probabilities. Again, I'm going to, in the interest of time, I'm going to skip that. Okay. Let me talk about the race aspect. What this diagram shows is on this axis, on the left-hand axis, this is median age around the world. The right-hand axis is deaths per million around the world. Now, obviously, this is a noisy data set. There are lots of ups and downs. There are some outliers here, but I'm sure you would agree with me that the pattern is very clear. Countries where the population is young, the median age simply says, for instance, if I say that the median age in Kenya is 20 years, that means 50% of Kenya's population is less than 20 years old. 50% is more than 20 years old. In contrast, for instance, in say San Marino, Portugal, Spain, Italy, etc., 50% of the population is more than 40 years old. So now what you see here is a steady increase in the death rate, because the countries with higher death rates are countries with more old people. And bear in mind that the countries with more old people are typically the rich, industrialized Western countries of the world. So according to Stanford's John Ioannidis, and this is not just John, it's not like one of the converts, one of the members of our temple. This is commonly acknowledged. For some of these countries, to the left-hand side of this chart, the infection fatality rate is 0.09%. That means 9 deaths in 10,000. For some others, the rate is 2 deaths per 1,000, which means for many of these countries, COVID isn't really a big concern, and most of these countries wouldn't really even have noticed COVID by and large, because they had much bigger things to worry about, things like tuberculosis, malaria, waterborne diseases. So for many of these countries, COVID isn't really a threat to their daily existence. Why did COVID-19 lead to mass hysteria? Because all of a sudden, white folks were being killed. It was no longer the case that all these brown and black folks somewhere in Africa that were dying. In South Africa, where people have gone on and on about this, approximately 47,000 people died from COVID-19 in 2020. Given historical trends, around 3 times more will die from HIV/AIDS this same year and other complications. 1 in 5 South Africans suffer from AIDS, which then combines with tuberculosis and of course combined with COVID-19 to kill a lot of people. Between 1985 and 2014, there have been 2.7 million deaths in South Africa from AIDS. And in neighboring countries such as Swaziland, Lesotho, and Botswana, literally 1 in 4 or more people suffer from HIV prevalence. Notice that the world is not rushing to roll out a vaccine for AIDS, no longer. AIDS doesn't feature on the main newspapers of Western countries. In fact, when an Indian firm called Cipla came up with a generic cocktail for AIDS retrovirals, 40 companies such as Merck, GlaxoSmithKline, and Roche sued the South African government for patent infringement. And Along the same lines, in December 2020, rich countries of the world defeated a proposal. TRIPS is the proposal under the World Trade Organization that governs intellectual property rights. So they refused to allow for generic manufacturing of COVID vaccines, which means two things. One is that the COVID vaccine will not get around the world as quickly as possible. And second of all, what we're going to have very soon is a world of vaccine haves and vaccine have-nots. So all of us in the rich countries will get our vaccines, probably, will travel back and forth, but the poor countries which will not have the vaccines or won't have a vaccine certificate won't be able to get on an airplane. Okay. So again, a long quote. This is by David Bell and Muhammad Usman Khan, writing for pandata.org. And this is what they say. And this is quite hard hitting, but there's no way to deny this anymore. They're saying that we now have a new paradigm for global health. Vaccinating children, not for their own health, but in order to protect a small cohort of elderly citizens. If we believe that the SARS-CoV-2 virus can and should be eradicated globally, and recognize that diverting resources for this program will cost lives, then we need to acknowledge that the children who are no longer benefiting from other health inventions are dying for the benefit of mostly elderly and chronically sick people in far wealthier nations who wish to reduce their own COVID-19 risk. All right. So there's a quote by C.S. Lewis, which says that the worst form of tyranny is that tyranny which is implemented with a genuine sense of goodwill for the victims. Okay. Mark, am I okay for time? Okay.
God, absolutely you are. Go for it, Ananish. Sorry.
Okay. All right. Okay. So now, those of you who live overseas haven't seen this, but those of you who live in New Zealand, you must have heard that, oh my goodness, look how wonderfully we're doing. Unemployment rate has dropped to 4.9%. So I saw this and I said, well, okay. Does that really make sense? So I went back and forth with various people, talked to people and Stats New Zealand, etc. And I asked them, well, what does this mean? Notice that the same report that says unemployment drops to 4.9% also says that despite this quarterly fall, this is only for the last quarter, December quarter of 2020, the number of unemployed people is still 25,000 higher than it was a year ago, increasing from 116,000 in the December 2019 quarter, which is a rise of 22%. Now, let me just go to the same next graph, and I'll come back to this in a minute, because this is what Simon referred to. So here is what we have. So this is 22nd of January in 2020. This is 31st of December. This is data from MSD, the Ministry of Social Development, in the number of working age job seeker support work ready recipients. This is curious, right? Because what you can see is starting in about January 2020, we were about 85,000 benefit recipients. That number jumped to about 120,000 in the middle of the year, thereabouts, April, May. And then it has gone steadily up a little bit. But if the unemployment rate fell, then why didn't this number go down sharply like this? Because in January of 2021, this number stands at 135,401. So how is it that the unemployment rate fell, but people who are not working, but receiving job seeker support, that number didn't fall? So that didn't make a lot of sense to me. So I went back and asked them questions. And the answer is very simple. The answer is that, let me back up there. The answer is very simple. The answer is how Stats New Zealand calculates unemployment rate. So the way the unemployment rate is calculated is people are essentially asked during the last 4 weeks, were you actively looking for a job, et cetera, right? So then we calculate what's called the labor force as people who are looking for jobs. within that 4-week period. And therefore, the unemployment rate is how many of them did not have jobs. So to give you an example, because this is averaged, say by the end of 2020, we had about 2,870,000 people who were in the labor force. These are people who are either working or looking for a job. And we had 140,000 people unemployed. That's what gave us the 4.9% number. But understand that when you look at the labor force, you are not counting the people who are not looking for jobs or have given up looking for jobs, etc. So when I asked Stats New Zealand this question, they said, well, if you want to get a measure of slack in the economy, then we typically tell people to look at what we call the underutilization rate. What's the underutilization rate? Underutilization rate is people who are unemployed, people who are working part-time but would like to work full-time, people who are working shorter hours but would like to work longer hours, etc. And that underutilization rate has increased by 58,000. But here's the crux of the point. The point is that if I now take those numbers and I add it to the labor force, if I assume that, well, these people would be looking for jobs, if you add those numbers, then your unemployment goes up to 6.5%. And 6.5% unemployment is actually quite different from 4.9% unemployment. So journalists could have looked this up. This is not rocket science. All I had to do was email Stat New Zealand, get their data, look this up. So this doesn't mean that I am right, they're all wrong. I may be wrong. These numbers, maybe the unemployment rate is a better measure than my numbers. But the fact remains that when you look at the fact that the number of benefit recipients hasn't fallen, when you look at the fact that the underutilization rate has gone up, that suggests that the economy is not in as great a shape as these journalists are making it out to be. Okay. With that, I might have used up my time, so I will stop. I'm happy to answer questions. I need to acknowledge Helen Kai, Ryan McGreevy, Stats New Zealand for the help they're provided. And some of this is coming from work I'm doing now, including a new book that I'm completing. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ananish. No, we've got actually plenty of time.
Okay.
So we'll see if we can tease out some of what you've been saying and some questions. Do you want to just spruik your book for a moment? you got a title for it, and when is it coming out?
So I finished a book this year called Behavioral Economics and Experiments, where some of this appears. And then I'm working on the book, which is tentatively called Uncommon Sense, Decision-Making and COVID-19, but it's under review. So I don't know yet. It's being reviewed currently.
Cool. All right. So decision-making. I think what you were saying at the start is we can't trust the science, mainly because we can trust it as far as it goes in terms of coming up with the CFR, the IFR, some of the data, although as I think we've learned over this past year, it's also a bit shaky in itself. But you've pointed out in terms of the politicians all choosing the same models for dealing with the response to COVID-19, that there seems to be an incredible scarcity of innovation in there. They're all doing the same thing. They all chose to do effectively the China model. No one really innovated. No one had any thoughts around different types of approaches, or and as you're suggesting, had the bravery to do so. How do we, if we can't trust the science, but we can't trust the politicians to take innovative leadership and make some decisions around the statescraft, the balancing of all those costs, we seem a bit stuck. How do we deal with that?
Well, I don't know the answer to that, but it's not, in some senses, it's not because some people like us who teach behavioral sciences, this is not that astounding in some senses. So it's not just me. I mean, there are other people like Daniel Kahneman who have written on this. I talked a little bit about some of this, about system 1 versus system 2 thinking, about gut feelings, looking at data and kind of trying to think through. It's a tough proposition. And it's not clear. I mean, these are things that it's a function of social institutions, etc. And obviously, some people like manage to sort out some of these things. But the fact is that a lot of these things where the information was available to us, the fact that countries with no land borders are not particularly at risk and things along those lines, I honestly don't know the answer to your question other than to suggest that this is something that we need to teach our next generation. You might be aware in the United States now there is a group of people called Heterodox Academy.
Yes.
Who are essentially kind of saying that, look, let's ask questions of people and leaders. Let's not shut off discussion. And I mean, one thing that I've said this before, one thing that I was surprised was that as a kind of so-called liberal, and I know that there's a lot more to it. I'm working on the difference between economic conservatives and social conservatives, things like that. But as a left-leaning person, I always kind of thought that kind of authoritarianism was very much right-wing, but I've now come to understand that there is very much kind of left-wing authoritarianism, which is what happened in New Zealand, because there was an enormous amount of effort to shut up anyone who asked any of these questions. So I guess this is a challenge for the next generation, maybe, and our generation may have kind of lost this battle for now. But at the same time, historically, it's not unusual. I mean, these things, these kind of madnesses grip people. It's probably that social media, etc., made the madness kind of global, whereas in the past, it wouldn't have become so global so quickly, I think.
You skipped through your probability part. I'm assuming that your point is that we have just overreacted to COVID. I guess in some ways, how much have we overreacted? Is that easy to tell?
Well, that's not so easy to tell. It'll depend on kind of maybe different countries and various contextual factors. But the fact is that we were overreacting to a very small risk, and we are kind of underweighting large risks. So we were underweighting the risks of lockdowns and things like that. So I don't have a good answer to your question, but I do want to, let me tell you an anecdote, right?
Yeah.
So as you know, most of our colleagues at the University of Auckland kind of have not been happy with us, and we have had lots of, lots of scoldings from various people, etc. So one of the people who sent me a long, angry email, he's quite well known, I won't name him. He's deathly scared of COVID. He's a, probably reasonably young man, and he probably wouldn't suffer too much from COVID, etc. But what does this person do in his pastime? He goes rock climbing. Now, the reason I'm saying this is because I'm sure you understand that the risk of bodily injury from rock climbing is actually quite high. So this cognitive dissonance was surprising to me, that here is someone who goes rock climbing and is happy to accept that risk on a day-to-day basis, but is consistently overweighting this rather small risk of COVID-19 and getting it out in the community and things like that. This was surprising, but this is again based on work in behavioral sciences. It's probably not too surprising in some sense. People do this, and what was difficult was to get through and explain some of this. Once the wheels were set in motion. So I said this last time, think about our kind of intuitive things as an elephant and our reasoning ability as a rider. You can guide the elephant, but once the elephant has set down the road, turning it around is no longer very easy.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think we've probably all got stories of people who have been judging the risk incorrectly. But even in one case of a young man who is fit that I know, who he says he's not worried about he's not particularly worried about the effects of COVID if he gets it, but he's worried about the long COVID. He's worried about the risk of that. So in your point, really, that once the elephant is set off, you keep trying to re-justify, in fact, the route it's taken,
Correct.
rather than change it.
Lots of respiratory diseases have long-term problems. I mean, I had pneumonia once, had to be hospitalized. So it's not just COVID. Many respiratory illnesses could lead to long-term health issues. But that's something that is true of other diseases as well. It's not particularly true of COVID.
Now, just going back to this, your idea around the leadership and a trade-off between all of the costs that were there, which has been advocated by politicians. Oh, it was interesting to note here in New Zealand, a New Zealand Herald journalist who said when the latest economic data came out that you're pointing to, that those good numbers showed that the health response was
Correct.
clearly the best economic response.
Correct.
So for their way of thinking, the response is that there is no balance of good. The first thing you have to deal with is the health response. And doing that properly helps everything else. And apparently, New Zealand is a good example of that. Can you comment on that?
As I said, I mean, it's possible, but there is, as I pointed out, a simple kind of, email exchanges with Stats New Zealand would have told them that the picture is not as rosy as all that, because there may potentially be a problem of people who have effectively given up looking for work. And that's not necessarily a good thing. Yeah. But as I said, to a large extent, our media has gotten into this very raw nationalism. I was actually a bit surprised because Jacinda Ardern accused the EU of vaccine nationalism, because the EU is saying that, you know what, we are not going to give you these vaccines. We're going to prevent them from being exported. And I thought that, well, and after having practiced nationalism in many shapes and forms for a long time, it's a bit of a pot calling the kettle black. But so I have written up this issue of 4.9% and how that doesn't really indicate economic health. We'll see if someone publishes that.
Right.
Because they publish some things I write, but they don't necessarily publish all of it.
Now, can we turn to the racial issue, which is something that Sunetra had raised in our first symposium back in August last year. And it's a very good point. As I understand it, what she's saying is that the rich, largely white and elderly nations have pulled back a lot of their external efforts and a lot of the charity and the aid, and people, and particularly people who are out in the world, and are more worried now about channeling the resources to deal with COVID, and that's the big effect. Are you thinking that is that the main one, or are there lots of other aspects to the racial divide, let's say?
There are many. You could go on and talk about various different issues in here, right? For instance, you could talk about what's happening within countries. You can talk about what's happening across countries. But this is certainly one facet of it, that in most of these third world countries, there are many other diseases that are far more deadly. But with the single-minded focus on COVID-19, we have kind of made sure that the kids haven't been vaccinated, resources are being diverted from other places. And it's not clear when these countries would even get a COVID vaccine, and why would they spend so much money on the COVID vaccine? These countries kids are dying from malaria, they're dying from dengue, they're dying from polio, they're dying from cholera, which is a waterborne disease, and all it needs is just clean sanitary water. So this is a gigantic waste of resources and kind of cognitive load to deal with a disease that is not a huge problem. So that's one aspect of it. You can talk about various other aspects of it. For instance, one of the things I talk about in my book is that this attempt to kind of, one of the things we have done is kept interest rates very low. And one thing that I think Gerhard might have pointed to this, one thing that will certainly do is increase wealth inequality within countries, because the low interest rates are primarily helping people who are already asset holders, people who own houses, are the ones who are buying more. the people who are not there will fall farther and farther behind. Similarly, there'll be things like that across rich and poor nations about trade relations. So there are many ways you can think about it, but by and large, I also quote from another paper. They go ahead and say this. I can dig this up, but one group of researchers are saying that, look, low and middle income countries really are completely on their own, and they live in crowded areas in large cities, so they really need to be on kind of devise their own policy. They cannot afford to listen to what the rich nations are telling them to do, because it is absolutely not in their interest to do so.
Yeah. I wonder if, as a last question, if you could just, I think you've touched on it in terms of the low interest rates, but is it also true that the printing money, or whatever the fancy phrase is it for the new monetary theory, that is more of a trickle down, that's going to disadvantage the lower socioeconomic groups?
Look, it's very hard to answer some of these questions, partly because there are lots of confounds. No one knows. It takes time to figure these things out, et cetera, right? So on the one hand, so one thing we need to understand, again, something I talk about in my book, is that this recession, so-called recession, is very different from other recessions. In other recessions, things happened, and then we were kind of responding to it, like the global financial crisis. There was a housing bubble that burst and things happened. But this recession is very different, because in this recession, governments are creating the recession with one hand and fighting it with the other hand, right? So this is not the same. I mean, we could have chosen not to create the recession in the first place. Now, of course, COVID-19 could have probably created a recession if people were afraid to go out, etc. Maybe, maybe not. In the absence of mass hysteria, maybe it wouldn't have happened to that extent. Maybe it could have. But the fact is, by locking down, we were exacerbating the recession. And then we said, oh my goodness, we have recession, so now we must fight it. But this is a bit counterintuitive, because it's kind of endogenous. You're doing things to make it worse, and then you're fighting that.
Yeah.
So that will have significant implications in many different ways.
Are you still picking a recession, or a larger recession than has been experienced to date?
Again, it's hard to know, but I believe that's true, because the current data at the end of December is saying that even though the so-called unemployment rate dropped, economic growth has not happened. So the economy would on the whole shrink, but we'll have to wait for a while to get the updated GDP data. The economy will certainly shrink.
All right, thank you, Ananish. Really appreciate the presentation, and looking at the comments as you were flying there, everyone else did as well.
Thank you very much. Thanks.
Thank you.